I hope you managed to catch our series, 100 Days of Donald Trump. If you haven't heard it, or you haven't heard every episode, they are all available on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. What does the man himself think of his first 100 days of his second term? Here he is with his assessment. It was at a rally in Michigan on Tuesday.
And we're here tonight in the heartland of our nation to celebrate the most successful first 100 days of any administration in the history of our country, and that's according to many, many people. This is the best, they say, 100-day start of any president in history, and everyone is saying it. We've just gotten started. You haven't even seen anything yet. It's all just kicking in.
But for all the great things he says he's done, for all the things he is promising in the immediate future, it is a simple fact that his approval ratings in the American public seem to be dropping, and that particularly because of the things he has done on the economy. How much does it matter? How much does he care? Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, this is Sarah, and I'm in the BBC's bureau in Washington.
And it's Anthony. I'm right here next to Sarah in Washington.
And it's Justin in the worldwide headquarters of Americast in London, England. And we are talking to you at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, London time, on Thursday. And I say that right at the start because, as we know, things happen very fast. So who knows what we will need to talk about in the days and hours ahead. But anyway, this is a snapshot at any rate of what's going on at the moment. And let us begin with that Michigan rally that Donald Trump held. So the first 100 days in office, that's the clip of the rally that you heard in the pre-intro there. And Sarah, you were in Michigan as well.
Yes, I went up there because that was the first rally he's had since he returned to the White House. So it was quite an event to go to. And I tell you what was fascinating was although the Trump supporters who were there were really, really enthusiastic, absolutely delighted to get to see him in campaign mode once again, it wasn't that busy. There were not queues round and round the block hours before the doors opened like we saw during the campaign. There were empty seats inside the auditorium. It just didn't quite have the size and the scale of the events that we all went to during the election.
I guess that isn't a huge surprise, right? I mean, the enthusiasms of campaigns get everyone really engaged, and they had one singular focus that they had, and that was unseating the Democrats from the White House. Now, Republicans are being pulled in a bunch of different directions, and perhaps there's some concern about the direction that Donald Trump is taking the country.
And I thought, there were plenty of the hallmarks in the performance, in the whole speech of classic Donald Trump. He was quite funny on occasions. He kind of meandered off into places that his speechwriter certainly would have been surprised that he got to, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that we're really used to. But there were a couple of things that were interesting, particularly, I thought. And one of them was this focus on the polls, because that does go, doesn't it, to whether he is or is not genuinely in the mood to change now as a result of what seems to be his growing unpopularity. So among the very many enemies he brought up, and Joe Biden was there and all the rest of it, Bernie Sanders even made it on, although he's not much of a threat to Donald Trump in the modern political era. But there we go. Fake polls. It was really interesting that it was the polls that he took issue with. Let's have a listen.
And that's why we got, despite the fake polls, they do these polls where they interview far more Democrats than Republicans. I saw them over the last few days, and I had them checked out. They interview far more Democrats for the polls. They interview Democrats by big numbers and then Republicans by small. They say, Trump only has a 44% approval rating. Well, it's actually not bad. But when you figure that if it were a legit poll, it would be in the 60s or 70s. These people are a bunch of crooked people.
What do we make of that?
Well, I'm not sure which poll he's referring to here. It might be the Reuters Ipsos poll, which showed him with an approval rating in the low 40s and actually an approval in his handling of the economy, which used to be a strength for Donald Trump, in the 30s. But it wasn't just that poll that has shown Donald Trump dip in his approval. And, polls vary by their methodology and thing. I think the interesting thing to take from these polls is that they do show a trend where Donald Trump was higher. He was even had a net positive approval rate in some of these polls, and now all of them are moving to net negative. But I can understand why Donald Trump will say, these polls are meaningless, they're fake, because we saw polls, as we've all discussed, in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election that showed Kamala Harris maybe narrowly ahead, is certainly a dead heat. And then Donald Trump ended up winning reasonably comfortably. So it's understandable that he might treat this with a bit of skepticism, and also understandable that he's worried that if people start believing these polls, it will undermine his political authority and power and ability to get things done.
Because by some measures in these polls, he's got actually historically low approval ratings. The ABC News Washington Post poll that found just 39% of Americans approving of his performance, that put him at the lowest point, at this point in a presidential term, of anybody for 80 years. And the second lowest was Donald Trump in his first term, third lowest Joe Biden. What I've found really fascinating about this is, so for one thing, a lot of these polls have tiny numbers of people who voted for Donald Trump saying that they regret it, like 4%, 6% in some polls. So you've got more than half the country voted for him, more than half the country think that he's not doing a good job, but very, very few people say that they would vote differently if they could have a do-over in November. And I mean, non-scientifically, completely anecdotally, I phoned back a few Trump voters that I met during the course of the campaign last year, and I spoke to a bunch of folks in Michigan when we quite deliberately visited a county that had voted for Donald Trump to find people who'd voted for him. And everyone I spoke to was pretty enthusiastic about how he was doing. Certainly wouldn't have changed their mind. And if there were things that they had trouble with, like some were unsure about whether the tariffs would really work out, they said, give it some time. It's only been 100 days. Nobody could fix the economy in that amount of time. So, I mean, of course, science versus anecdote. Obviously, you would go with the bigger and more scientifically weighted polls. But just my personal experience is there doesn't seem to be that much buyer's remorse from Trump voters. What do you think, Anthony?
I think Donald Trump's base, we have seen, will stick with him. And they very reluctantly second-guess things that he's done. I mean, he has that 30 to 40% of the American public that will ride and die with him. So that's going to be his floor, I think. And then it's a matter of how many other people, independents, Democrats, he can get to be on his side. And he certainly won enough of those in last year's presidential election, the only poll that really matters, to get the presidency, get the White House back. But I think it's perception that is the danger here, because Republicans, unlike Donald Trump, are going to have to stand for a re-election next year. There are even some in state races that will have to stand for re-election this November. And if they start feeling like Donald Trump is not popular and that he's pulling them down, that's when you will see them start to break from the president.
Yeah, exactly. And when you say this November, it's New Jersey and Virginia, isn't it? These governors' races, these sort of off-year governors' races, and the Virginia one in particular. So, there's a Republican governor of Virginia at the moment. If that is turned around, and if the Democrat wins and wins big, it seems to me that is when you can put the opinion poll all to one side, in a sense, because now you've got proper, real evidence, hard and fast evidence in an election of people changing. And that is the moment where it seems to me that for Donald Trump, all of this crystallizes into the bigger question: do you change as a result of your waning popularity, or do you not change, or do you double down, or what do you do, etc.? It seems to me that November is the moment when that really happens.
I'll say something about Donald Trump's specific critique of polls, too, because he's saying, they're asking more Democrats than Republicans, and that makes these polls bunk. And most polls don't wait for party ID, because party ID, it fluctuates, it shifts. People say they're independent, but they're really Republicans, say they're Republicans, but they're really independent, say they're Democrats, but they're not. So it's tricky to try to weight it that way. Same with recalled vote for the previous election. A lot of people will either lie or misremember about who they voted for, or will say, oh, I didn't really vote for that person because that person is no longer popular. They don't like what they did, or they say they did vote for someone because they want to have been on the winning team. So that's it. Polling, as we've discussed in the past, there's a little bit of art to it, a little bit of science to it, and so it's it is kind of a challenge to get it just right. But just to say, well, they asked more Democrats than Republicans in this, that makes the results of these polls meaningless. I think that's going a step too far.
Do you think people are reluctant to tell pollsters that they made a mistake with their vote? So if you do find somebody who says that they voted for Donald Trump, you say, do you regret it now? And they say no. Is that because they don't like to admit they were wrong a few months ago?
When you ask someone if they've been scammed or fallen for a crime or some sort of, hoodwinked somehow, you have to admit that you made a mistake, that it's your error. And so I think it's kind of human nature in any kind of a situation like that, whether it's voting for someone who now you regret or doing something that you regret. It's just difficult to kind of acknowledge that, particularly to a stranger who calls you on a phone, or punching in numbers on a phone or on online survey, to be able to have that kind of self-awareness to do it.
I can't remember which polling company it is, but one of them asks the question regularly, or asked it at least once, somewhere down in the weeds of the poll, asked the question, do you currently have a captain's license to drive a nuclear-powered submarine? And to which the answer should be, it should come back as 0 pretty much, because so few people do that in any poll. But actually, kind of, they were getting sort of 20%, particularly of men, saying, yeah, I think I probably do have that at the moment. Somewhere in in other words, Trump is onto something where he says they're not necessarily reliable, but it's just not in the way that he suggests. They're not trying to be skewed. That's the point, isn't it? You make money from polling by being accurate. That's the point.
Right, exactly. There's no political agenda behind it. Or, there's some polls that do have a tilt one way or the other, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But yeah, there is value in trying to be right. And I think most pollsters, most ones that we talk about, the mainstream pollsters that we see out there, they are ones who are doing their best to try to get it right, because it's their reputations on the line. But yeah, in any poll, there's 10% who believe in aliens or believe they've been abducted by aliens, and so when you start to get down into those low numbers, I think anything below 20% approval for something, and you can say that yeah, it's universally hated, whether there's 10% of people who say they like something totally strange or bizarre.
Donald Trump flew back from Michigan on Tuesday night, landed back at the White House on Marine One to find another set of numbers that were not good for him. And these are harder to dispute when it is the Bureau of Economic Analysis coming out with the quarterly GDP numbers, the gross domestic product numbers, i.e. the total of goods and services in the US economy, January, February, March of this year. Pretty important numbers, and they showed that the economy had shrunk very slightly by 0.3%, but that's a fairly precipitous drop from almost 2.5% growth in the previous quarter, and that's pretty difficult for him to try and explain.
Yeah, I think the thing that's particularly concerning for Trump is that end of March, this was before the latest trade drama. This is before the Liberation Day, where he announced these massive tariffs that he has since walked back to some extent on so many different countries all over the world. There is some critique of these numbers that a lot of it reflects the fact that companies were stocking up on inventory and importing a lot more goods to prepare for the prospect of tariffs, and that drove down growth rates showing up in this. And there are other measures that will probably show that the economy still grew a little bit, but it is signs of weakness in this economy, and should be signs of concern, given that we're now dealing with these tariffs and we're now dealing with dropping consumer confidence and possibly rising prices because of the tariffs, that the economy is heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it seems to me the real problem for him is not quarter one, it's quarter two of the year, where all of this begins to unwind. So quarter one, exactly as you're saying, Anthony, GDP is basically everything, all economic activity, minus what comes in the way of imports. And there were a lot of imports because people were preparing for Liberation Day, which was, April the 2nd, I think,
yes,
so
yeah.
the beginning of the next quarter. But people were well aware that it was on its way, and they were stocking up on inventory. And so that huge amount of imports, extra amount of imports, might be responsible for at least some of that drop in output because people were busy stocking up on stuff from abroad. But in quarter two, you won't be able to talk about that to the same extent. And what you will be able to talk about is, for instance, the trucker whose job is to bring stuff from the port of Los Angeles or Seattle across America and drop it off at Target or Walmart or wherever. And there is nothing to come. There's nothing to put in the truck. And the trucker loses his job or her job and doesn't spend so much on, I don't know.
What truckers eat and drink?
Yeah, they eat and drink. And they then, that means that the company that produces that piece of produce that isn't so much consumed itself lays people off, perhaps gets rid of one shift, etc., etc. It's those sorts of things. It's those knock-on effects that slow an economy down that it seems to me could mean that there will be another quarter of negative growth, and 2 quarters of negative growth, of course, mean that is officially a recession, and that is something that will really sting Donald Trump, because it will be a word, although he'll fight against it, and we know already the sort of things he'll say about it, but we know that as well it will really hurt him to have people talking about a Donald Trump recession, which is what it will be.
Right.
Well, he'll try and blame Joe Biden, of course. I mean, he said that the bad figures that were released this week were Biden's fault, nothing to do with him, even though he was in office for over 2 of those 3 months. Now, there's a certain amount of truth to say that there is a lag in the economy, and no president could come in on the 20th of January and completely turn it around, although it is his threat of tariffs that meant there was that surge in imports. It'll be much harder, obviously, to in 3 months' time, after nearly 6 months in office, to blame Joe Biden for all of that. But I heard Donald Trump say the most extraordinary thing yesterday that really, really took me aback when he was talking about this economic slowdown at his cabinet meeting.
President Xi of China.
It'll happen. I mean, look, right now, and I told you before, they're having tremendous difficulty because their factories are not doing business. They made $1 trillion with Biden, $1 trillion, even $1.1 trillion with Biden selling us stuff. Much of it we don't need. You know, somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally. But we're not talking about something that we have to go out of our way. They have ships that are loaded up with stuff, much of which, not all of it, but much of which we don't need. And we have to make a fair deal. We've been ripped off by every country in the world, but China, I would say, is the leading one, the leading candidate for the chief ripper offer.
Look, there are lots and lots of people who would argue for very many reasons, from environmental ones to childhood development ones, that maybe you don't need to have $30. But that is completely antithetical to the entire point of the American consumerist economy and American dream,
Can you
isn't it,
imagine?
Anthony?
Can you imagine Joe Biden coming out during the heart of the inflation surge and saying, well, you know, yes, prices are going up, but Americans still just have to learn how to get by with less. I mean, he would have been torn apart. They would have dragged him out of the White House.
Fewer Barbies all
paraded
around.
him down the street. Donald Trump is trying to blame this on Biden. But really, turn what around? I mean, the economy actually was doing really, really well by these same metrics over the past year, and maybe people weren't feeling it because they still kind of felt the lingering effects of inflation. But growth was great, as you mentioned, 2% the previous quarter. And actually, Donald Trump a year ago, January of 2020, was trying to take credit for the stock market boom and the economy, saying that it was really Donald Trump's stock market in January of 2024, saying that this was Donald Trump's stock market, not Joe Biden's, and he should get credit for all of this growth. So now, a year later, when he is actually president, he's saying, no, the things that are going wrong are in Biden's lap.
Justin, I don't want to worry you, but the general perception has been that if you can only have $2, it won't be Barbie and Ken, it'll be 2 Barbies, and that the real victim of a doll squeeze is going to be that the Kens are going to be left on the shelves.
Well, that's a shocker. I mean, all I know is I came back from the US after a decade there with young children with a lot of Barbies that I think are still in the attic. And the idea that you could be limited to 2, I find genuinely shocking. And I mean, I agree. I just the you've got to get your story straight in the end, haven't you? Either you say to Americans up front, look, you're a consumerist idiots. You're buying loads of stuff you don't need. Stop doing it, which is an approach. As Anthony suggests, not necessarily a great approach. And or you say, hang on a second, we'll go through some tough times, but actually you can have as many barbers as you like maybe next year. And Trump himself put on Truth Social, didn't he? Patience in all caps. The idea that people, there's going to be a temporary turmoil, and then you'll get back to normal, which led me to think, have you ever met any Americans? Because I don't think patience, particularly the American consumer, is not a patient person, it seems to me. But there you go. But they got to decide one way or the other. And the idea that you just say suddenly, okay, let's not be consumerist anymore, I mean, it just seems to me to be mad.
Yeah, they're saying both, basically. They're saying don't be consumerist, and this is only temporary, and it's not really a problem, and actually the economy is going great. I mean, they're throwing everything out there, which risks coming across as what they don't know what's going on. They're out of touch, or it's just a muddled mess. But you mentioned truckers, and there is tangible evidence now in shipping numbers that these giant shipping containers that are coming over from China are coming over empty or half full, that there is going to be in the coming weeks a very significant drop in the number of goods entering this country because all these Chinese manufacturers have shuttered their factories or delayed sending things because they don't know whether there are going to be tariffs on their products or not. So that will have an effect on dock workers unloading or not unloading crates. That'll have an effect on these truck drivers, as you mentioned, who are driving all over the country delivering the goods. But then it's going to have an effect on retailers who won't have any kind of goods to sell. They're going to be, if there are, and it looks like there will be, empty store shelves. That is something that maybe Americans feel even more than seeing a fraction of a percent decline in the GDP numbers for Q1. And it's going forward. These things have long tails, so this could even be something that has fallout for Christmas or for fireworks and the 4th of July. I mean, these are things that will not be turned around overnight, and that is going to be a very real problem for Donald Trump.
So then the question is, Sarah, is he going to bin it? I mean, are we going to see a complete U-turn, the whole thing junked?
I wouldn't put it past him because he's been weaving and dodging all over with his tariffs policy. I mean, when it comes to retailers that Anthony was just talking about there, Walmart, Home Depot, Target, they were all in the White House last week, warning genuinely of empty shelves if they didn't take some kind of action. And up until now, Donald Trump's been brushing that off. And we know that now is when retailers are ordering for Christmas. And if you speak to smaller, independently owned stores, they say they just don't know what they're doing. They're not ordering their Christmas stock, or they're not producing their catalogs. They can't price their goods for Christmas. They just don't know what's going to happen with Christmas. So I think if there's a genuine fear about that, he may well change tack, because look at what he did on tariffs on car parts already. Just the beginning of this week, he suddenly changed his tune, and you are no longer going to have to pay tariffs if you're importing certain kinds of metals like aluminium and car parts that are made of that. You won't pay a double tariff. So basically, he's making it easier to import foreign-made car parts. Now, this is somebody who made a huge deal when he introduced these tariffs about returning car manufacturing to America. Now, lots and lots of companies said, hey, we do make our cars in America, but we import some of the car parts. Even Elon Musk and Tesla import some of the parts that it takes to build their cars. They were brushed off to start with. And we even had cabinet secretaries saying, they didn't want German car manufacturers here in America where people just assembled their German cars. Those weren't good enough American jobs. Well, that's all changed now because obviously there was going to be a real tangible effect. And so suddenly he can ease these tariffs on car parts today. It'll be something else tomorrow. There is a lot of weaving and dodging around on the tariff policy.
The risk, of course, is that you can't count on that. You can't plan your business strategy based on, well, maybe he'll change his mind right before things really go south. And so all of these companies are sitting here trying to plot out what they're going to do. And they are paring back their investments. They are paring back their production. They are trying to rely less on imports because they don't know what's going on. And that's been the real challenge from the very beginning for this. Donald Trump could have laid out, like, these are the tariffs, this is how it's going to come in, it's going to be gradual, which I think is exactly what Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, was advising him to do. But he listened to other people like Peter Navarro who were saying, no, you got to go big, hit hard, make a big splash. And so that's why you get this big splash, and then paddling back, and then trying to ramp them up again, and then being worried about. And that is just it's a dangerous way to conduct any kind of economic policy.
Let's focus for a moment now on opposition to Donald Trump, and in the form of one particular opponent of his, a big opponent at the last election who lost to him.
We all know President Trump and his administration and their allies are counting on the notion that fear can be contagious. They are counting on the notion that if they make some people afraid, it will have a chilling effect on others. But what they're overlooking, what they have overlooked, is that fear is not the only thing that's contagious. Courage is contagious. The courage of Americans who are banding together in the face of the greatest man-made economic crisis in modern presidential history.
It was dear Kamala Harris, who we haven't heard from for a bit. In fact, this seems to be the first major speech she's made since Donald Trump took over and since she lost. And it comes at an interesting time because it's a sort of reintroduction of her to the American people, but Sarah, potentially with a purpose.
Well, so there's a lot of speculation about whether she's wanting to get back into politics, and particularly whether she wants to run for the governor of California. And it's not just a decision that she has to make for her own personal career. She's kind of frozen the Democratic race in California, with all sorts of other people not wanting to declare that they're going to go if she's going to be running for it. So in some ways, it is very important because it's a huge state, obviously. It's a very, very Democratic stronghold, and it's where a lot of Democratic talent comes from as well. So people are watching that, not just, and also because it would be very curious to see if she could make a comeback. The response to that speech, I would say, people are interested always to hear about the idea that there is a resistance coming to Donald Trump. There's not much evidence of the contagious courage that she's talking about, I don't think. So what do you think, Anthony?
I mean, I think there are signs, certainly on the grassroots level, of people starting to become more active. There have been demonstrations today, May Day. There are demonstrations around the country. They certainly aren't on the scale that we saw in 2017 after Donald Trump first won the presidency. You've seen some members of Congress start to get a little bit more traction in criticizing the administration, but again, Democrats don't have any power in Congress, so there's only so much they can do. But yeah, I think the party and the resistance, if you want to call it that, is looking for a voice, someone out there who can kind of give voice to the anger in the Democratic base. And one I want to point out is J.B. Pritzker, who is the governor of Illinois, who went up to New Hampshire, which is a very important state when we come to presidential politics, and gave a fire-breathing speech about how his party needed to resist Republicans all the time and everywhere, and that he's not normally a guy who would be calling for demonstrations. He's kind of a moderate, and he's a billionaire, but he was saying now is the time where we have to draw a line in the sand and fight. And I think maybe even more than Kamala Harris, he is one to watch for the upcoming kind of auditioning among Democrats to become the voice of the party.
Justin, Anthony's saying that, the Democrats are looking for a voice. The voice we just heard, I suspect, is very much not the one they're looking for. Possibly Joe Biden would be the only person less likely to
who gave a
lead the
speech too, and
resistance.
I think no one really paid attention to that either.
The thing is, that courage line, which is very typical of her, isn't it? I mean, a Democratic fundraiser who's not, I should say, a great supporter of hers, but someone I know was saying to me that she had that courage line, but then who are the two groups who she singled out for showing courage? Number one, she singled out the judges, including this judge who's recently been arrested, who may or may not have committed a criminal offence. But anyway, judges, I mean, is that really where the Democratic Party wants to be? Backing judges particularly as showing courage? Is that rather than their own politicians and their own people? But the other group was the Ivy League universities, who are having this great fight at the moment with the administration. And we've talked about this in the past, that they, again, the rights and the wrongs of it, put it to one side. But are they absolutely the most popular thing that mainstream America is up in arms about, trying to make sure that Harvard doesn't get $2 billion taken off its, whatever it is, $53 billion wealth? I don't think it is. And what my friend was saying is that, he said she's always manages to get it kind of semi-right and then just go off on this tangent that politically, never mind what you think about it ethically, morally, but politically, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, if your party's been accused of being too much on the side of the elite, speaking out for judges and Harvard University probably doesn't help that perception that much. And the thing about championing judges is that the legal system, the judicial system, moves so slowly, and any kind of victory you win is always kind of tinged with, well, it might be appealed, and this is going to be a process that goes out until you get to the Supreme Court. And even then, Supreme Court victories aren't always as clear cut as people would hope that they would be. So it's going to be a challenge. She's not the first person to lose a presidential race, and then 2 years later, if she does run for governor of California, do you know the last one to do that?
Well, it's Richard Nixon, isn't it?
Exactly, and he lost and had that famous quote, "You're not going to have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." Of course, then another 6 years later, he ran for president again and ended up winning. So no matter what Kamala Harris does, she's young. She might be able to find some sort of a political rehabilitation and ultimate victory somewhere down the line. The career for politicians can go a long time.
Now, before we go, we've had this email from an Americaster, from Isla McCampbell Rose, who says, "Dear Americast, I'm just on the phone to my gran, Dorothy Rose, discussing the goings-on in the world. 98 years and 8 months. She's still as sharp as a pin. An avid BBC Sounds listener, and maybe your oldest Americaster, question mark. She's pretty remarkable. Either way," and there's an emoji of a big grin of the kind that I use, and Mariana tells me it's a sign of age itself to use it. But anyway, it's a very nice emoji. And there is a picture as well, a really wonderful picture that she sent us with, you can see it there, great-grandsons, Elliot, who's 10, and Joseph, who's 12.
Yeah.
All of them Americasters, even you, Elliot, at 10, because although I said that 11 was actually the cutoff, of course I was joking.
Dorothy looks great, and I'm so glad that she's listening to us. Hello, Dorothy.
Yeah, and so that's it. Officially, Americasters from 5 days old, who we heard about last week, to 98 years old. And not that far off 99, Dorothy Rose. Delighted to have you with us.
Yep, and we'll still be doing it when we are all 99 at various stages still to come, because there is plenty to talk about. That's it for now. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.